Okay, so we're on to panel 6. We have this panel and one more, and then it's a lovely evening here in Belgrade. So this panel is going to be a cracking one, I think. The EU's own illiberal challenge, authoritarians in the house and the backyard. And on this panel, I can see them there, is Natacha Kazatchkine, excuse me, Milica, Delevic, Selim, Koru, Zsuzsanna, and the moderator is Una Hidari.
Hello, everyone. Give us just a second to sit down and get our bearings together after that creepy video. It is an immense pleasure, despite the topic at hand, for me to moderate a panel with such illustrious panelists, because our time is short, and I believe all of them could spend the entire allotted time just discussing their own topic, the topics that they focus on. I won't be wasting much time, and I'll start with a question immediately to Zsuzsanna Szelényi. Zsuzsanna, you come from the big, scary country of Hungary. The one that is most often spoken and mentioned in the context of authoritarianism, especially authoritarianism in the EU. Why is that, and how did it, if you can briefly talk about what authoritarianism means in Hungary today?
Well, I'm not sure we have a big country, but we definitely have a very matured illiberal autocracy or illiberal state, or whatever we call it. It's definitely something we developed in Hungary in the last 12 years. And the idea behind is to do a different kind of democracy. At least this is what Viktor Orban is suggesting, that this is a democracy, it's just a different one. So there are other types of democracies than the liberal democracy we used to in the last 30 years in the West and in Europe and in the European Union. And it's very easy to sell this new type of something, because it is actually very different from classical autocracies or dictatorships. It goes without violence. This is the most spectacular part of it. A bunch of people capture power without violence. And it's very difficult to notice. Things are very normal. This is also a step-by-step process, so you don't really see it from the beginning. For example, most Europeans believe that illiberalism in Hungary is since 2014, when Orban actually declared it as an illiberal state. But we actually saw it much earlier. This is something else. And until it didn't have a name, people didn't recognize that this is something very, very different and very dangerous. And of course, because it's step by step, there are no red lines. For example, the constitution which Viktor Orban's party made in 2011 was already amended 10 times. The election rules were amended since 2012 more than 20 times. So which was the point when you could say this is not a democracy any longer? Actually, I think constitutional legal advisors can tell that this was Amendment 4, which was already done in 2012, when the tasks, the competencies of state institutions were deeply changed. But the people did not really see it. So the profile of these new autocracies is very subtle. It's just happening day and day, and it's in the power accumulation of a bunch of people. A certain elite is growing in the economic field, in state capture, and also in society in many ways. So that is why it's so difficult to speak about, because you don't know where the red lines are. You don't see this so easily.
By big, I meant bigger than life, big bad wolf, as in scary, not actual, not referring to the size of Hungary. But you make a very important point, which is that Hungary's the decline in the democracy index, or the way democratic indicators, began a lot earlier than when. Way before than when the world started paying attention to it. And why weren't, since our topic at hand, just a brief follow-up question, why do you believe that at the time there weren't more triggers or more alarms being raised in Brussels about constitutional amendments and other things that were done in the country that led to what we have today?
Well, today autocrats are elected democratically, and they maintain the facade of democracy. There are elections. The thing is that over the time, the chance for peaceful transition to change a governing elite by elections is less and less. I would say that in Hungary, it's not possible any longer without a major breakout. What we are today, after 12 years, is actually the normalization of autocracies. So we are not speaking about the democratic decline. We actually accepted autocracies within the European Union when constitutional democracy is now meant by majoritarian democracy, where participatory civic politics is changed for plebiscitary mobilization. The government is mobilizing masses in the streets to support the government, and they say this is civil society. There is a European integration based on some kind of shared values that the commissioners were speaking about, but actually there is a rising network of illiberal regimes, and we can name them and we can see them. And this is parallel with what we call the European Union. So this is a very, very different state of affairs than even 5 or 10 years ago.
To transition very quickly to another country whose European position is of relevance to this audience, Milica, why do you think, what is the relationship between Serbia and the European Union, and to what extent are they enablers, and to what extent can the EU be more involved in the country?
I would say, I'm sorry, I mean, I'm having a sort of strange
echo.
A strange echo, difficult to get used to it. I would think that it pertains very much to EU's relationship with countries in the neighborhood and generally EU's ability to be standard bearer of certain values, which is related to two things. One is how quickly you expect those countries, Serbia or any other country, to see the benefits of either joining the European Union integration or any other concrete benefit, meaning what is the price of non-compliance. And the second is what Zsuzsanna was talking about, how an organization which is dealing with challenges within the organization, how it affects its ability to project those values in its external relations. And then I think it also has a lot to do with relationships with countries in the neighborhood becoming not burdened, but having so many, you try to address so many challenges with a single relationship. You first are trying to address the managing of migratory flows. I'm sure that Selim might mention this in case of Turkey, and I think also pertained with the Balkans. Then you're trying also to look at geopolitical challenges, you're looking at energy challenges, and therefore the agenda becomes a little bit crowded.
Yeah. It's a great segue into actually asking Selim, how would you describe the relationship between Turkey and the European Union? Because it's oftentimes observers will neglect the influence and the interconnectedness of Turkey with both member states, but also members on the periphery, or as the panel indicates, in the backyard. And how, to what extent can the Turkey influence policies in the EU, and the EU influence policies in Turkey when it comes to authoritarian and or autocratic tendencies?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that the reform process in Turkey, especially in the 2000s, was driven by the EU package, if you will. The EU had this amazing magnetism, and it really defined in the 2000s especially, the agenda for Turkey. And it was a package of sorts in which the EU's influence was most visible, because it provides the sort of social framework, how media is supposed to behave, how civil society was supposed to behave. And behind that structure was also a very strong IMF, World Bank influence of sort of privatization and all that. That drove the agenda for the 2000s, really. And then by the time you came to the 2010s, that began to change. Turkey's domestic dynamics were basically saying, okay, well, we don't like this imposition anymore. We're going to have our own agenda, and we're going to sort of push back against what's coming in from the outside. And part of how they were able to do that is because the privatization allowed a restructuring of the country's sort of, who basically the people who owned the country, right? And basically the way the economy worked, so that at this point, more and more, they could have their own sort of pretty independent sphere of not just economics, but also politics, right? And these days, the way it works is that Turkish politics defines itself in opposition to, I think, European influence, whether real or perceived.
And how does an average Turkish citizen perceive the EU at this point?
In a very complicated way. I mean, if you were to ask people, if I were to, give you an EU passport, would you move to the EU? Vast majority of people would say yes, right? But then, if you ask them to vote, they're very likely to vote for people who have unfavorable views of the EU, right?
Why?
It's the whole, it's talked about a lot these days, the whole argument of resentment. Why, as you pointed out, why do we have to be in the backyard, so to say, right? Why do we, there's this idea that there's two halves to the world, one half that works and one half that doesn't. Why do we have to be born into the half that doesn't? And if you sort of feel your way into that sort of emotional space, you come to the conclusion that, well, it must be because the other half made it so. And in some sense, that is true, of course, right? If you look at history, if you look at the history of colonialism, of Western modernity, of course, yeah, there is a sense of vast injustice embedded in history, right? And we are born into the part of the world that lost out in the history of modernity, and we have to catch up, if you will, right?
Yeah. Just briefly, because I want to ask all the panelists precisely about what you're talking about. Before you do that, Natacha, I'd like to come to you. To what extent do you think the EU is or isn't encouraging and/or enabling illiberal tendencies within itself and also on its periphery?
Yes, thank you. I think the European Union is definitely not only is not meeting the challenge of what's happening within its own club of 27 member states. I think we have to all realize that the situation is very serious. I mean, we heard what was happening in Hungary. We haven't mentioned Poland, which is the other member states with which, together with Hungary, have made a fundamental break from EU values. We were talking in the panels before. But this is acknowledged. This is not, everybody, all the reports, all the experts, everybody sees breakdown of rule of law, of respect for fundamental rights, of respect for democracy. It's all out there. So we have these two countries in the EU, and we've been hearing today, whether it be from Ukraine, from Russia, from people, candidate countries, how much they consider EU as a democracy. So EU has a very serious problem, and as much as it wants to keep it away, and it would rather wait for things to settle, it may well eat it from inside. And for me, I find astonishing that we're in a space of the most sophisticated human rights system of protection, where we've had evidence in real time of what was happening. So maybe there are new phenomena, as Susie was saying, but they are now, we have the analysis of these new illiberal regimes and how they function. We have had that analysis. You would expect EU democrats and leaders will be in the forefront of this fight, and yet the disarray, the silence, the deafening silence, political silence about what this means for the EU and about what this says about the EU institutions and member states, that they were not only, they didn't do enough, but we see that the situation is getting worse. That is the last reports from the European Parliament. The situation is getting worse in those two countries and in Europe. So I do want to just insist in this moment, I mean, to be quite grave, I mean, to have some gravity, because I want to quote something that we always, as advocates working on rule of law in the EU, and all the papers usually quote him, but this is coming from the president of the Court of Justice of the EU. This is not coming from an angry politician, academic, or NGO, and he's saying, it's no exaggeration to say that the foundations of the Union based on rule of law are under threat, and that the very survival of the European project in its current form is at stake. And I'm just putting that here when we talk about the future, because it is creating immense problems for the EU. And it is a bit of a paradox that you have this non-response when this crisis that we see is arguably the only true and existential risk to the EU that we're seeing. I also find it astonishing in this, as we're talking today, with the war raging in Ukraine. When I hear, each time I hear about, EU officials, EU leaders, saying, acknowledging how Ukrainians are dying or fighting for Europe, for us, for our freedoms, for our democracy, I can't help wonder, well, what Europe is it that they're now fighting for, dying, that is not able to stand up against autocrats within?
The honor?
And I think the EU has been extremely complacent and very lazy, but also slowly undoing its own potential to uphold the values and the democracy that it has held. And I can go more into how it's done that.
Like I said, all of us have so much to say, and there's such a limited time here. Zsuzsanna, Natacha talked about Ukraine and all this, and as we've seen, Hungary has transitioned from being largely on par with the European Union when it comes to sanctions packages and gas policies that relate to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, but now is slipping away from that. Is this a reflection? What is this a reflection of, and how does this fit into the authoritarian matrix?
Yeah, it's absolutely very directly close to the autocratic type of leadership what Viktor Orban and his government is doing. And it's this, because what you said is that it's a very egoistic way forward. It's based on the idea that the West is not strong enough to maintain itself, to lead the world. And there is a maneuvering in Viktor Orban's policy, foreign policy, foreign trade relations. It's very explicit in foreign policy, but it's also elsewhere, to see where else can we move. And there are other big forces in the world. I mean, Russia doesn't seem to be such a big force any longer, and I think they are aware of this, but China definitely is. So when Orban came up to power, he already in 2010 made a in the significant shift in his foreign policy, and he loosened the European relationship very openly. He differentiated Europe from Brussels, from the European Union. So there is a kind of double language. Hungarians are very European. He is actually the most European. But we are skeptical towards the capacity of Brussels, namely the European Union. And it is possible because, as you said, the European Union is not capable. Of course, when we speak about the European Union, that's the European states, right? So it's political willingness of the member states. This is not the institution itself. But the institution, which is led by the European states, is not so capable enough, neither to stand up against authoritarian practices, governing practices, and also keeping the union together. And in this environment, Viktor Orban, who made already Hungary very dependent on Russia during the 12 years he's in power, which has Hungary is more dependent on Russia today than 10 years ago, and this happened under his leadership. He goes on his own way. As Erdogan or other similar autocrats, they just don't trust the global institution system any longer, so they try to figure out their own way. And of course, at the end of the story, this is disastrous for a small country like Hungary, because of course we do need allies. In our history, we needed strong networks in order to survive, and this is what we are losing in these days, and that's a huge problem for Hungarian future and national security, but that's actually happening now. And then this comes out in the relation that Viktor Orban goes out and makes separate deal with Gazprom, with Vladimir Putin, while at the same time he's voting for the sanctions, just losing trust, and of course destroying the unity or the competency of the EU to move together, but not completely. So this is also this kind of, this halfway. He is actually participating. He votes with the EU majority much more than when he opposes. So this is why he's always accepted, and he can always make his private deals.
And just briefly, how are citizens reacting to this? We had the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, and then people, where the memory of being invaded by, a bigger power, greater military power, and having a revolutionary spirit crushed is still so very poignant, if I'm not mistaken, in Hungary. How do average citizens react to that, and react to the fact that, their country is, basically what you said, pulling itself out of global institutions and or creating a more of an abrasive relationship with global institutions?
So first of all, there's not an average Hungarian any longer. Right? It's
so that's a misconception.
Divided country, and the voters of Viktor Orban, who have never been more than 30–40% of the people, believe what he says, and the majority of people who never voted for him, they think completely different way. So there is no midway through. This is also the product of this autocratic leadership. That it's not. There are two Hungary, and they're very different from each other. The other thing is that the 56 in Ukraine, it's a very interesting thing, but also very typical, I think, for many other autocrats, is how such a regime is reinterpreting its own history. And for example, 1956, which is so obviously an anti-Russian revolution, Russians go home was the major slogan of the revolution, a generic slogan of the revolution. What is happening now is that Fidesz or Viktor Orban and his consultant, they are just rewriting the story that Hungarians were against a big enemy. They were the little heroes of David and Goliath, but they don't speak about Russians any longer. So it goes into this other frame of resentment that we were against the big enemy, but they were not. They can be whoever, and then the way how they narrate, they tell the story today, it reflects to the today fight against the Brussels, basically. So actually autocrats invest a lot of time and money for narratives, and it's 21st century linguists and psychologists are working on figuring out how people's mind work. It's very, very professional. And, you know, with amateur ways, you cannot fight against these people.
It's almost too easy to transition to any Hungary topic right back to Serbia, but Milica, what would you add on to what she said? But particularly looking at the ever-strengthening relationship between Serbia and Hungary, especially on issues like energy and so forth.
I think first I owe you a part of the answer to the question of whether the EU is an enabler, and I keep thinking about it because it resurfaced.
Ever the perfectionist, so please.
No, the question is whether the EU is, and to what extent, I think more appropriate than the question whether it's an enabler, whether it is equipped to deal with these challenges, why it didn't react to Hungary or Poland earlier, because the way the EU functions is you need everybody to take a decision, and obviously knowing that this is how the organization functions, you tend to take a longer view, hoping that further down the line things will self-correct or that the engagement will bear results. And I think once you have a member inside, it's more difficult to exercise conditionality, which I think the EU is learning to do with the pandemic fund, with the Next Generation EU funding, which is now becoming conditional. And it also has implications for those outside of the EU, because seeing how difficult it is to deal with leaders once they get inside of the European Union, then you think, okay, I mean, they may be there and I will have a relationship with them and I will pursue the agenda, but it actually makes me rethink the process of enlargement more generally. On strengthening of ties, I think it's generally...
Well, just to briefly interrupt you on this point, exactly, the EU is rethinking its approach to enlargement precisely because of the shifting dynamics, political and otherwise, on its periphery. But then when the country that ranks worst in terms of liberal democratic index is in fact the one that is the furthest along in its integration process, i.e. Serbia.
I think the real question is whether the process that lasts so very long and in which the perspective is blurred and the benefits become ultimately intangible, whether it's the right anchor for the democratization process. That's what I try to say, to what extent the EU is equipped. And I don't know whether it's rethinking enlargement only because of what's happening outside of the European Union, or whether primarily what's happening inside of the European Union and seeing how difficult it is to reverse things within the European Union makes the organization also rethink what's happening outside. And I think if you look at the progress reports for various Western Balkans and for various candidate countries, now that I look at Turkey as well, they record in a very bureaucratic language, but you can make sure that progress reports of the European Union, they are all 100 pages or so, and everything is in the report. It's just how you frame the narrative so that the relationship within this context continues. So the relationship continues with an ever more distant end point and ever less clear, concrete thing, which might increase the price of non-compliance. Being a perfectionist, is it okay to transition now to the question of relationship?
It's really important.
I wouldn't be able to say much about how how close this relationship is, not having been here for almost a decade now. What I can notice is that generally, it's a global phenomenon, because if you look at the Freedom House reports since 2016, you see the erosion of democracy in a number of countries. And if you look at VDEM, if I'm correct, the last reports assessed the level of democracy globally at 1989, meaning that all the gains that have been achieved over the previous 30 years would have been reversed. So you have a more sort of a bigger club, so to speak, and effectively what existed as power to shame leaders and societies which were not subscribing to the same set of values is eroding. And I think if you also, you have different models that you can aspire to. If we think of the end of the Cold War and the end of history, Fukuyama's thesis, it looked as if you have only one model that is functional. Now you have more models, and some countries are saying, well, you know, look at China, look at something else, and this makes it more difficult to say that there is only one functional. Now, I can imagine, and having seen some of the public opinion polls, especially those that BPAC has done last year, that in Serbia, popularity of leaders indicates certain models that people feel closer to, and it is true that Viktor Orban ranks as one of the most popular leaders in the country.
Just briefly, if you can, how is Serbia perceived in Hungary? Because we often talk about how Hungary is perceived in Serbia, but how is the relationship perceived in Hungary, if you've been following that?
Well, I think that Viktor Orban and his government makes a lot of effort to influence, to raise its influence in the Balkans in various ways, politically, economically, and Serbia is definitely a strong partner in this, but it goes to Macedonia, it goes to Bosnia recently, Croatia, it's no question. So I think there's a lot of...
Slovenia, which
yeah,
don't like
Slovenia, of course. So basically, Viktor Orban looks at the region as a potential partners, but also as a region of influence.
Yeah. Natacha, so there was talk about all these things that could be done, that should be done, and you very poignantly highlighted the grave state of affairs. Is there any element of optimism that you can inject as into how some things can be curtailed or slowly be rolled back?
Yes, so I'll answer this question also going back to a few things that was said. First, I just want to talk about the relation with Russia and with Ukraine. I want to again remember people of the situation in Poland. And in that case, we have a very different positioning of Poland in the region and with the EU. So what I'm getting at just here again is that, and it's back to the point you were making about these different forums, the way things are discussed with countries, clearly rule of law, human rights, democracy is not at the center of the conversation. It comes after, and you get these strange moments where, you know, suddenly EU seems lost what to do with Poland because Poland is our biggest ally and taking so much responsibility with regard to the war in Ukraine. So how can we, you know, be monitoring them on rule of law or saying that we may have concerns there? And then, you know, what we saw and what we're seeing is that they actually don't correct their course of action, take a very, also recently quite EU anti-stance, and that it's a problem in its own, this nationalism that's growing very radical in the two countries. Then what was said was the EU is not equipped, and that we hear a lot from the EU itself. We're not equipped. We were there agreeing, we were not prepared. You know, when it's just a fact that our tools are not there, we're too slow, we're big. And then there's the question of this, and I'm saying all this then to come to maybe more optimistic. Then there's the model issue. Of course, if you look at the model proposed by big imperialist, you know, models of China, for example, and you think of democracies of the EU, I mean, how do they think we can continue to try and compete model to model based on that? I think the EU failed also dramatically to be a pioneer in proposing some other model, in accepting you know, the vulnerability it has because it's so diverse, because it's made of democracies, because it's never going to reach perfection, and because that's exactly what it is. And instead, it's extremely defensive. And I think the solution is really to look towards stopping this, and I'm quite worried, this sort of self-defeating rhetoric that you have in the EU. If you look at how all the excuses they are finding, or if you look at the conversations going on with Hungarian and Polish authorities, and we have had access to numerous freedom of information requests to some of the dialogues that are going on, you see that the EU is really buying into this communication of these illiberal states. So they think, oh, but if we intervene, we're being hypocrites, you know, because we're not perfect, and nobody's perfect, and there are many other problems, and there's something they do well. Then if we intervene or be too strong, then it will backfire. People will not support the EU anymore, and you know, we want the EU to support, we want people to support the EU. It will cause more problem. We will sabotage our own great culture of dialogue and of compromise. And then finally, you have this quite contradictory argument that comes up of futility, which is, well, you know, at the end of the day, we can't do anything. We know it. Our famous or infamous Article 7 proceeding needs unanimity to be triggered, to have a country lose their voting rights. We'll never reach that, so why even try things before? And I think there's absolutely need to get out of that mentality. On the tools, they have tools, and this is really a message we have to get to EU leaders. They do have tools to stop what's happening. And if I want to mention one that is going on right now, it's the conditionality tool. So this is about conditioning the EU budget allocations to Hungary. It's been triggered only towards Hungary for now, and not vis-à-vis Poland. So if we condition this amount, allocations of money to the Hungarian government to some fixing very serious rule of law deficiencies. Many steps were made. The Commission actually went so far to say, yes, we think we have a case, and 60% of the money should not be disbursed. And yet, we have another delay in the vote coming in the Council. Member states have to vote this. They have to, at last, they have a way to show that there are these general deficiencies affecting the EU budget. If we have to negotiate, if indeed Hungary would come to a situation where it's seriously considering reforms, these can be discussed. This is built in the regulation. There will be time. But at some point, if you continue refusing ever to make any political statement, as these two states have, as the Parliament and the Commission said, crossed the lines of EU values, you're never going to be credible, and you're losing in this kind of cat and mouse game going on with the two countries, and EU is always behind. Now, the two positive things I do want to say is that civil society, on the other side, when I look at it, I think they don't have this double standard problem. They don't have this politically, partisanship and political games going over. And they have shown great solidarity across the borders among each other, taking the cause also of rule of law in Europe, strategizing together. We see it happening in France, in Italy now, a lot of exchanges going on. And so you do have that really important force that is there. And I think in a very rare conjunction with academia, who stepped up a lot, and with think tanks and policy analysts, to really keep hammering that there are ways that the EU institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, but most of all, the EU member states can move on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Selim, Natacha talked about Poland in general, and Milica mentioned this earlier with regard to migration issues that have, well, propelled far-right leaders into power in most parts of the EU and on its periphery. Hungarian, Polish, and other leaders rode specifically on that migration wave to achieve some of the stability they have now, politically speaking. What is the perception of Turkey? What do, I daren't say average Turkish people anymore, and you're completely right, it's a misconception that you can put one person into a box and assume that they all vote accordingly, but if I were to hypothetically, what do average, call upon an average Turkish person, how do they perceive the migration issue? How has it changed since the crisis and stuff like that? Since Turkey takes on the lion's share of migration and stemming migration towards the EU.
Yeah, I'll address that, but I like what Natacha said also about sort of how to confront, for the lack of a better word, authoritarianism or far-right nationalism in these countries. I do absolutely agree that the EU within itself has a lot more tools and should be a lot more confident in the way it handles these things. Of course, in the near abroad, it doesn't have those tools and can't do those things. But within itself, I think definitely, and also the sort of the ambivalence, the self-doubt that you see within the EU itself, I think radiates outside. So that if the EU was much more confident in its principles and in the way it handles problems within, I think the outside world would also have a lot more respect for the EU, and it would have at least some of its magnetism and sort of standing back. On migration, again, I think
considering that it was the EU-Turkey deal on migration was kind of one of the key pieces of policy that's signed between the two.
On migration in Turkey, first of all, it's a very, very new issue. I mean, especially Western Europe has for, I think, a couple generations now been a destination country for economic migrants, at least for a couple generations. For Turkey, it's very, very new, and it happened all of a sudden. And Turkey is one of those countries where things change very quickly. So within the span of maybe 5 years, maybe less, Turkey became a destination country for economic migrants, not just because of the border issues, the Syrian civil war and the wars in Iraq, but also because the government just built it that way, right? So we have lots of migration coming in from Central Asia, from different parts of the Turkic world, on different kinds of visas or without visas, right? So big, very symbolic parts of Istanbul, for example, are now destinations for migrants. Taksim Square, Istiklal Street, all those places that, if you've ever been to Istanbul, you've visited. Those places used to be places where it was just Turks most of the time, and then maybe Western tourists. Now they've changed radically in character. And this is a very new thing for Turkey, right?
How does this tie in, just with, briefly before we turn to audience questions, so I hope everyone's preparing their very exciting and intense questions, but how does that sort of correlate with Erdogan's grasp on power? Is he seen as someone who's managing it, or someone who, does he use it to vilify outsiders, or how is that played?
So migration to Turkey is different in Turkey than Central Asian or Middle Eastern migration to Europe, right?
Through Turkey.
From Turkey, because in the tradition of these far right leaders, Erdogan sees the world in terms of sort of civilizations, right? And part of what he's about is about changing the structure of Turkish society to be more, I mean, he is from the Islamist tradition in Turkey, so he's not very pan-Turkist, right? He doesn't really mind if people speak different kinds of languages in Turkey, right? So parts of his government do, right? But he himself personally probably doesn't mind, right? So he wants to see a much more conservative and Islamic Turkey, and he has a thing about population, so he wants the population to grow, and the businessmen around him probably want labor costs to go down, right? All of this obviously means that more migration, the more migration, the better. And Erdogan is a very genuine person, if nothing else. So he says this in his speeches. He says, well, the more the better. We want people to come here. We have a tradition of opening up our gates to those less fortunate. So we want them to come. I can probably say the vast majority of the population doesn't want this, including his base. Most of his base, shall we say. I think that, if I was to guess, it's probably a 15% or so of the country, or if you were to stretch it to 20, that is comfortable with migration, or at least even if it stays at this level, right? And more people coming in, but not more. Most of the country is has a pretty ethnic sense of nationalism, right? They don't want people to be of Turkey, they want people to be Turkish.
Yeah. It's fascinating, actually. So I can't see mics being passed around. Question here, question there, hi. There we go. Mic's coming up. 9 minutes, we can manage. Please keep your questions, obviously, to actual questions, not comments or statements. I know that with such a panel, there's obviously a great urge for back and forth debate, but let's do that in coffee break.
Hi, Szelényi, board member of BCSP. 2 quick questions. You were speaking about the crisis of imagination or confidence in EU, and I've seen it also in my work with politicians and students from the West. Can you explain why what's going on with authoritarianism is not just the issue of post-communism and post-Ottoman world, but why it could happen in Western Europe? That's one question. And the second question is, what would you ask for if you could have a wish list for support of re-democratization of Hungary and Turkey? I mean, Turkey has elections soon. And for Hungary, we know it's a super difficult. Even if Orban lost, he changed the system so much that all the resources and rules would still benefit his party. So what could be done if you get back democracy again, and what kind of support would you need?
Natasha, do you want to start first? And then Zsuzsanna and everyone else. And obviously Selim.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And I think you made a point that's very important, first of all, and that comes up whenever I'm debating this question in countries that are not Eastern or Central European. You see a reaction from the floor, and I think it's part of the problem also that happened. Oh, but were these countries ever really democracies? Like, this is about, did they ever finish their transition? And I think this is also something really problematic, because if you really then engage in that debate with the activists, with the people, you realize it's not about, north, south, east, west. Yeah, there's some things that can be explained, there's some particularities. But I think when it comes to where the EU failed is certainly looking back at its own, history. I mean, fascism, imperialism, colonialism. It's not like EU didn't have serious, issues that it needs to deconstruct, to look at, to address. EU, Western and Southern member states. So this is something they have not engaged. This is something the European Union never really invested in. I mean, until this crisis, and it's been going on for more than 10 years, it was hardly impossible. I mean, you were not talking about these issues, democracy, rule of law, within the EU, in a European circle. You didn't even have funding anymore for organizations who do that. and of countries that had now joined the EU or who were old member states. This didn't exist. And I think what is quite impressive now, I mean, what makes us think, is that you're seeing that the EU is slowly coming to the realization it needs to reinvest in that making of, what is democracy, how do we renew it, who are the actors we need to support, bring on the table, and it's a question for all of us and for citizenships. And this is something it hadn't done, and we realized that in a number of countries of, Western Europe in particular, there's much less even. I'm shocked that if I talk to colleagues, in Hungary, in Poland, here, in Ukraine, there's much more thinking there also about this new democracy, this new world, the big transitions, the digital, the climate. And it hasn't been thought through like that in the other countries. And I think the EU is slowly coming to that realization. It also had never monitored really what was happening within the member states. And one thing I wish you would do also, as if we could say something positive comes out of this crisis, is that it's not looking at it's refusing that it learns that there are some systemic issues that need to be looked at in a systemic way. And because if you look at the new rule of law report, it's concerns here and there and different values, but no reflection on trends, no reflection on, the future, what does it mean, how to evaluate that. Absolutely, this is still totally lacking. And some professors, and I can share with you later, have actually done and proposed now for France what they call a resilience test on authoritarian shock, and it's quite interesting, and they've used some methodology from the European Central Bank, which does stress case on how banks can face economic breakdown, and they've used that to look at how much, in the very plausible scenario where an autocrat would become head of France, would the system survive, first of all, and so giving also ideas of how to build that democratic resilience now we hear commissioners talk about, but we don't see a lot going on. So I hope, this answers a bit.
Zsuzsanna, please.
So, of course, redemocratization is a more interesting issue than learning about autocratics, because we are so bored by them by now, and that's the interesting question. And I usually say alliance building, but now I actually say that as something else, because we have tried, and Hungarian opposition now failed 3rd times with trying to figure out some alliance, and it just didn't work. And a reason why, there's a lot of analysis why, but the main reason why it didn't work, because the many fractions just didn't trust it that together they can get better than individually. So this is exactly what is happening at the European level. And there is no trust that the EU can do better than individual member states. This is why Viktor Orban and whoever is doing their own business. But France is doing their own business, and Germany is also doing their own business. So there is the model in the crisis situation, and we are in crisis since 2008, that all countries try to figure out something which is better for them, and there's no leadership in the European Union which would actually show a way forward and which would create or show some kind of alternative that makes the EU really indispensable, beyond the point it is indispensable today. So this is, I think, if a couple of countries would really do something brave, that could be a change maker.
Selim, I think there was part about Turkey as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by, what would be my wish list or what I could change. I think, the one positive, the big positive thing going on in Turkey is that young people have a radically different perception of politics, I think. And the party bosses in Turkey, I think they're all above the age of 60, well above the age of 60. So And the system is set up in a way that party bosses pretty much dominate the whole agenda. So if you could have a way to undo that, and if you could have a way of, of getting out of jail some of the very effective politicians there are, I think it would be a much different field than it is today.
I think there was a second part to your question, but no? Can we get 2 questions? Please, sir.
No?
Does this work now?
Yes.
Okay. Niels Mojniks, Amnesty International. Question. Does the war in Ukraine, is that a gift for authoritarians? Seems to be a gift for Mr. Erdogan. Is it also a gift for the Poles and the Hungarians because of the imperative of having some kind of facade of unity against Russia? And how does that play out?
Maybe.
Shall we
Yes,
hear
sorry,
the other
second
one?
question. I get distracted by people talking. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question? No. All right. Well, yes, please.
Well, I'm not sure that the war is good for Orbán Viktor and Hungary at all. I mean, his politics is good until actually the global world is working well. Then he can do his maneuvering, which is very much built on what this globalized world made it possible. So a world which is more bipolar and makes everyone to take side, this politics doesn't work. And now he's getting to a more restricted political, space. And this is why Hungary is really isolating itself. I mean, Orbán's Hungary, I always have to specify. Because he doesn't want to take side, but he will have to. And it's his own trap. He always wants everyone to take side because he's a polarizing person, but he wants a world which is not polarized, but no, he's going to see a polarized world. So it's not good for Hungary, and I don't think it's good for Poland. It's a destroyed Ukraine is just not good for Poland in the midterm.
I know we're running out of time. I'm going to be a little autocratic and just take, again, another minute. Natasha, briefly on Poland, I think that you touched upon, just, with, again, the migration stuff and everything, Poland has gotten less flack. I feel how it's gotten less flack from the EU.
I mean, I think there's no way we can say it's a gift for Poland on no fronts, and now it's it is confronted a very dire situation. Economy it has welcomed millions of people that need to be integrated in the country. It is just near the border with the France, so I think that there's no way we can say it's a gift. I think for very small, it was very short period of time, I think, where the rhetoric of Poland being in the forefront, doing so much, we should absolve them or the Polish government of all the trouble. I think this was very short-lived moment, but they will use it in the negotiations with the European Union and the other member states.
And Milica, just briefly.
No, I would probably differentiate whether it's good for a leader or whether it's good for the country. I don't think any of this could be good for any country, but I think it could be good for. It's probably bad for pro-Russian authoritarian leaders if the primary criteria is geopolitics, we might get some authoritarian leaders on the right geopolitical side, which might mean that this agenda about which we've been talking the previous hour is again not going to dominate this relationship. But what I think the question is whether countries leveraging their purportedly neutral position can be something which not necessarily, I can imagine somebody who is not authoritarian leveraging this position, which then is a different question, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's it for now. Would really encourage you, thank you so much for your time, would really encourage everyone in the public to read and follow the work of the panelists. If you didn't catch the names at the beginning, they're all in the booklet. I got lost in thought thinking about the about all the possibilities of with which the authoritarian and illiberal tendencies in the EU and outside of it could be challenged, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Thank you so much. Someone else will come and do something else now. And if you have more questions, obviously, we can all have them in the coffee break.